So even the Eurostar, which I thought was one of the last remaining functioning pan-European institutions, has now been experiencing regular delays and regular issues. It's not as bad as Deutsche Bahn or anything like
Right.
the British rail system, but it
Because the German
is
trains
getting
not running on
worse.
time is like a pretty emblematic.
The
But the
clearest,
Eurostar,
the clearest sign of European decline that you can
Yeah.
see is the Eurostar. I mean, it was a bright
as
new
long as
future when it was running
someone could
directly
make the
to
trains run on time.
when it was running directly to Amsterdam. That was going to from London. That was going to be the new future, but only lasted a few years. But yeah, that sounds like
Even that postmodern early 21st century
yeah,
future has been taken away from us.
it's a
Yeah,
nightmare.
yeah.
The Erasmus utopia, etc.
But
Even that.
it's really, I think, a monument of a certain type of French modernism as well, because the Brits contributed relatively little to it. It has to do, of course, I think, between the financial balance of power between Paris and London, insofar as Paris needs to get to London, but London doesn't necessarily have to go to Paris, which I think reflects the strength of the city. So the Eurostar was mainly financed by French contributions, but still, the fact that it's now lagging is not a good sign at all.
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le bunga, bunga. Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustavia, on fait le bunga, bunga. Stockholm ou Monaco, ou Montevideo, Oslo, Tokyo, on fait le bunga, bunga.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to BungaCast, and it's great to see Anton Jäger back on BungaCast after a prolonged absence, overlong absence, and of course George Hoare in London.
Yeah, I've been absent for the right amount of time from the podcast.
the week, the regularly allocated 7 days.
Yeah, I've just been talking at my computer and hasn't been being recorded, so it hasn't really been quite so podcastable. But Anton, yeah, good to see you, and welcome back. Yeah,
I feel like Anton doesn't need an introduction, but maybe if you want to mention any affiliations, obviously you can read and you can listen to Anton on BungaCast, many previous episodes, but also read him writing about US and European politics, about hyperpolitics, about populism, which we've talked a lot about with Anton on this podcast. I don't know if you want to mention any institutional affiliations.
No, not really. I mean, I'm still teaching in the UK, which I guess gives me some kind of external window on Europe now, but I don't think there's anything
to see.
No,
you got a window seat, but it's like there's nothing. It's just clouds.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't think there's that many benefits to having that affiliation now.
All right, very good. So, I mean, as you write in a piece in the New York Times from last year, but which has gained a special relevance now, about Belgium, a country with a population roughly equal to metropolitan Paris's, that has 6 governments across 3 regions and 3 languages. So I guess if you're if you're the opposite of Ronald Reagan and think I'm from the government and I'm here to help, is like the best words you could hear in the English language. Belgium may have something for you. Indeed, English serves as a bit of a lingua franca often in Belgium as well. So English is indeed correct. I'm not, don't correct me and say, oh, it should be Flemish, but no. So anyway, Belgium now does finally have a government, a second period of kind of an extended period without a government, not as long as the world record set some years ago. But Belgium's new government sees the radical right prevailing there for the first time after, I think you make the comparison that it kind of comes long after countries like the Netherlands or Italy have seen the rise and entry into government of similar sort of figures. But I'd like to know what accounts for the radical right success, and also, and specifically, who is it? Who is the NVA? Who is De Wever? How are they similar or different to comparable, perhaps, European forces?
Yes. So before I actually give you the full chronology, I'd say, of the last year and a half leading up to this government, I would say the radical right is now in government. There's a party that's even further to the right than the current NVA, the Vlaams Belang, so the Flemish interest, who were really one of the innovators on the radical right scene in the early 90s. So together with the National Front, they had one of the first spectacular breakthroughs in 1991, and I think they augured the sort of steady secular rise of the far right in the last 3 decades. They've done rather well, both on a Flemish and a Belgian level, in last year's elections, but they didn't win enough to actually be able to become indispensable for any coalition. So what a lot of people feared, namely that the so-called cordon sanitaire would break, which was not an informal, but an actual formal agreement to keep the Flemish interest from participating in government. So all parties except for the N-VA, which is a more moderately right-wing, mainly Flemish nationalist movement, have signed this agreement. There were fears that finally they were able to burst through it. That didn't happen, but it still took them very, very long, particularly to come up with a government on the federal level. And that's not surprising because on a Flemish level, it's only with Flemish parties. On the Walloon level or the Francophone level, it's only with the Walloon parties. But on the federal level, you actually have to reach a deal not just between different ideological camps, but you also have to pacify Walloons and Flemings with each other and form a government. And it took them very long, not as long as you said as the record you had in 2010, 2011, when basically Belgium went through the entirety of the Euro crisis, or a large part of the Euro crisis, without any active government, just an interim replacement. But now they've managed to cobble together a coalition. It's not an unprecedented coalition in Belgian history. I'd say ideologically, it's made up of liberals, Christian Democrats, and socialists. But the very striking thing about it is that the biggest party and also the leading party that's delivering the prime minister is a Flemish nationalist party. So it's a party that was historically founded, or at least is still nominally dedicated to the dismantling and the abolition of the Belgian state. So it wants to split the country, or at least radically confederalize, as they call it, the remaining federal structure. And now they're delivering the prime minister. And when you look at the governmental accords that have been composed, so the basic deal for the coming 4 to 5 years of government, it includes almost no promises on further regionalization. So a Flemish nationalist at the head of a state which he historically was supposed to bury, now getting into power with no promises whatsoever to actually follow through on that historic mission. And of course, a government, I'd say, that is firmly to the right, even with the inclusion of a socialist. And this is something you particularly see in the plans for migration policy they've just compiled. So there's a whole austerity side to the governmental deal, but it's particularly on migration that you see that the effect of the radical right has been quite profound, even if they haven't been able to break through this cordon sanitaire. I mean, they're really, really quite drastic measures when it comes to curtailing immigration. Obviously, it's also coupled with an austerity effort insofar as they think that the money they can take away from migratory spending can now be saved, etc., etc. So in that sense, I wouldn't compare it to the Dutch or the Italian or the Polish situation where the far right is actually firmly in government. But at the same time, it would be very naive to say as if it's had no hand in what the current government actually looks like either.
I wanted to ask about the relationship between the NVA and Vlaams Belang, because I'm reminded by a point made recently to me on X by colleague Csaba Toth. Apologies if I've pronounced that wrong in Hungarian, but that, you know, the Hungarian situation tells a story about the weakness of the left and the absence of any threat from the left, that when you have had a kind of even further radical right outrider, so in the case of Hungary, it was Jobbik, contesting Fidesz's kind of relative hegemony of the political field, they rose, they mounted a bit of a challenge, and then they faded away, effectively showing that, well, the bourgeoisie certainly has no need for any more radical force on the right. And that occurred to me listening to you talk about Vlaams Belang, which threatened to make a breakthrough. They tried to mount cordon sanitaire, and I wonder whether you think there's some kind of deep truth expressed there, or if it's just a contingent or kind of contingent factor, or a reflection of kind of tactics of the cordon sanitaire working.
Yeah, so I think the fact that they missed the mark they actually wanted to catch, so they were hoping to go above 25% towards 1/3 of the electorate, basically forcing the NVA to accept them as a potential coalition partner, because there was an arithmetic in which it would have been impossible to actually form a government without including the far right, at least on one of the levels. And once you include it on one of the levels, it has all kinds of repercussions for other levels. So I'd say that is slightly contingent. It's not as if there were any deep structural factors determining the exclusion of the far right there. At the same time, I do think, yes, that particularly in Flanders, because of course the far right is a particularly Flemish phenomenon. It's not something you see in Brussels or in Wallonia. And the striking thing they often say about Wallonia, of course, is that it looks a lot like the north of France. In fact, geographically, it's very continuous with it. But the north of France is and has been a bastion of the National Front for decades now. It's a severely deprived, deindustrialized region. And the Socialist Party has gradually abandoned its post there, and the far right has really moved in. That hasn't happened in Wallonia, and it leads to all kinds of theories of Wallonian exceptionalism, which are very interesting. So in Flanders, it's absolutely the case that you have a very powerful employer class that's mainly situated around German exports, or that's just a kind of export capital faction. And they, I'd say, are not particularly eager for the Flemish interest to get into power because they're also very, very dependent on certain targeted forms of labor migration. And that holds both at the bottom of the labor market, but also for more professional ends of it. And much of the economic program that the Flemish interest puts forward is simply too left. I mean, left is, of course, relative in this case, but too redistributive and too restrictive for that part of Flemish capital. At the same time, they haven't been very eager to embrace or support the far right, but what mostly happens is that these employer organizations make a kind of deal with them once they become electorally irreversible. So once it becomes clear that the far right is the only force right of the center that's able of achieving some kind of stable hegemony, then they will make peace of it, but make very, very clear demands as to what that redistributive program entails. And I do think so. I mean, this is making the discussion very abstract and really pulling it beyond the Belgian example. Once again, the difference with the 20s and 30s is that fascism expressed a double crisis. It expressed the inability of the bourgeoisie to stabilize its rule and the inability of a working class to work through its revolutionary potential. Today, and I think this is really the key factor that's missing because there is no working class uttering a revolutionary threat. It's not even unable, it's nowhere near a pre-revolutionary situation. The attraction of the far right and the sources of success of the far right is purely a function of the failure of liberalism. And this, I think, also explains the Flemish case, is that the far right in Flanders also lives off the failure of the center to keep its coalition together, particularly to do the kind of class cohesion between employers and employees, which so much of these centrist parties were absolutely crucial for in Europe. And if a right-wing party is still capable of winning elections, like the N-VA was, because many people suppose they wouldn't, but then in the last months they did a kind of catch-up operation, this really decreases the need to even take the far right very seriously as a governmental partner. And I think that's happened with the Flemish interest. They weren't big enough to become indispensable, and at the same time, they're clearly not the expression of a left-wing threat either. So that makes them typically contemporary. And I guess also that's what means that they've now been sidelined and they'll become an opposition party for the coming 4 years.
Right. No, and it's a story which I guess you can trace in different kind of ways through different countries, which is playing out. And I think we still haven't seen, I guess, what a Europe mostly dominated by radical right parties actually looks like. That's something that's very much in development, and how it comes to lose its insurgent spark, and how that plays out will be very interesting to see. You mentioned already the way that the N-VA kind of abandoned its more radical promises, probably its most radical promise that it would make to electors in terms of splitting up Belgium. And one can think of other examples elsewhere in Europe, particularly in challenging constitutional constraints and constitutional orders, in terms of leaving the European Union or even challenging the euro or anything like that. So how does that play out when the populists don't have an insurgent threat? We haven't seen, I think, what the contours of institutionalization of populism really look like.
Yeah. I mean, there is a general point to be made, of course, that you have these twin waves in the 2010s, a left populist and a right populist wave. And obviously the kind of crystallization or the semi-institutionalization and also the politics success of the right-wing wave has clearly proven more successful than the left-wing wave as well. That obviously just has to do with the fact that the expectations are a bit lower on the right in a capitalist society. I think that's just a banality, but it's very important to indicate. To get into the I'd say, more sociological aspects of the NVA, it's a party that I think that's divided between three constituencies. And it'll get quite complex, but I think I'll be able to explain it relatively briefly. So you have the actual electorate that votes for them, which I think is mainly suburban middle class and parts of a wealthier working class. So it is mainly professional middle class electorate that's very much invested in its asset wealth, that has relatively high wages, and that you could say is mostly not in classical employment relationships, but mostly independent but relatively wealthy. So it's not at all a proletarian base, it's quite a middle class base. Then you have the selectorate, even though, of course, you don't have the kind of donor system as you do in the US or even visions of it in the UK. There's much stricter restrictions on financing parties by private actors in Belgium. Still, the real source of personnel and also the source of advice that this party has is Flemish employers. And then you have the actual militants. So those are three constituents. So militants in the party, the actual electorate, and then the selectorate, if you want to call it that. And the only constituency of those three that I think has a really vested and long-standing interest in regionalization are the militants, because they've been in the party for ages. They've often come from families that were actively Flemish nationalist, and they're very frustrated by the fact that now their party is in government, they're delivering the prime minister, but they're unable to do anything about Belgian state reform. The electorate, I think, mainly is with the party for money. So, I mean, this is a really vulgar explanation, but I really think they do vote for their money when they vote for the party, which, I mean, is a perfectly sensible materialist reason to vote for a party. But the selectorate, I think, has a complicated but very unpredictable relationship to regionalism, in that Flemish employers like regionalization if it means more capacity to do right-wing policy. So if you regionalize and this tilts the balance away from a Belgian state that's still partly controlled by the Walloon socialists who have veto power of a lot of policy on the federal level, then they'll be in favor of Flemish independence. But if you could do right-wing policy on a federal level, which has now become much easier because the right has also won in Wallonia, and in fact, the party that now delivers the rest of the ministers is the right-wing party, the Mouvement Réformateur in Wallonia, then the whole case for Flemish independence, which is an economic case to them, collapses. There's no need to regionalize if we can have right-wing policy on a federal level. So why would you federalize that? And I think that's been the curse of the militants of the NVA, is that both the electorate and the selectorate of the party are simply not interested in their task. And this puts the NVA in this very difficult double bind between the historic activist base and then the new voters, and then, of course, the wealthy Flemish capitalists who have a very opportunistic interest in regionalization because it's just meant to serve their interests. Yeah.
Right.
No, I think that's really nicely put. I actually preempted a follow-up question that I was going to ask. So I just wanted to make, or maybe my question is then, how do you pronounce the first name of the founder of the NVA? Is it Geert Bourgeois?
Geert. Yeah. So this is one of these. It's one of these glottal terms that I think Anglophone speakers never develop.
I can't. But anyway, it's good to have a party founded by somebody called Bourgeois. I mean, it's just you know where you stand with Geert.
The party also actively reoriented itself around this electorate at one point. I think it was lured into a so-called second marriage with the Flemish employer base, which it didn't have before. It was very much a kind of professional middle-class party of school teachers, as they say, school teachers and lawyers. And then it became a party really of businessmen. And I think that commercialization or embourgeoisement of the party has now come back to haunt the regionalists, because it means that it's mainly a right-wing austerity party and not an independentist party. No.
It is interesting. I mean, the obvious point, I guess, to make about regionalization and indeed kind of some of these smaller separatist forces in Europe is that it's always dependent on the kind of shell of the European Union, that genuine independence isn't ever really sought. And particularly ones in richer regions whose main complaint is like, we're spending too much of our tax money on keeping you other poorer regions afloat. It's very easily appeased. So it's never the combustible force that some people like to make out it is, and indeed that they sell to their supporters.
Imagine like a Lega Nord that remained the Lega Nord. So the Lega has
Yeah.
actually transformed itself in a sort of broader anti-system force that now even draws voters in the south, which was something that was unimaginable in the 90s. But the NVA is still much more of a Lega Nord than it is a pure Lega, because it's still theoretically dedicated to Flemish independence. But of course, as you say, regionalization and independence in a political sense means complete subordination on an international or geopolitical scale. So it means subservience to German export capital mainly. And of course, Flanders as a wealthy region is just a playing ground for American capital that need access to the European continent. Like the whole of the port of Antwerp is basically devised to give the Americans access to mainly German export routes, etc., etc. So making Flanders independent, is in no way going to alter this dependence. In fact, it's probably going to intensify it.
Well, and these questions of being a little guy and being kind of shaken around by much bigger actors is something we're going to come on to. If you, listener, I'm sorry to disappoint you, this episode is not only going to be about Belgium. I know you're very excited to hear more, but we're gonna move on in just a second, because we're going to talk about American hyperpolitics, and we're going to talk about return at the end to European decline in broader terms than just about Belgium, or indeed about the Eurostar. Though I'd love to talk about trains for an hour in a country which has absolutely no passenger rail anymore. So it's just an envious glance northwards on my part. I did just quickly, because I think this might work as a segue. I read that in the Financial Times that De Wever, now Belgium's new prime minister, recently wrote a book called On Woke, in which he blames a good part of the intellectual elite for pushing people towards more extreme right-wing groups, which seems maybe a slightly better and more sharp take on wokeness than the kind of the standard fare that you get from the kind of national conservative right.
Yeah, I hate to disappoint you. The book is atrocious, of course.
I'm glad you've read it, though. It is by the sounds of it.
Yeah. It's profoundly uninspired. So once again, I'm not someone who's completely averse to the idea of having a discussion about it. But what's so annoying about so many right-wing contributions is that they don't even meet a benchmark of intellectual seriousness that would allow you to actually talk about it. It's mainly a paraphrase of a lot of Douglas Murray and the most vulgar contributors to the Anglo-American woke debate. But I think in party strategic terms, it was very visible what that book was meant to accomplish, because the party was increasingly seen as too centrist, too much, too governmental. So a kind of establishment party that wasn't actually able to carry out any of the reforms that it was promised to do. And then the woke book, and they actually did quite a large media offensive around this whole theme. So there were loads of conferences, loads of interviews, all kinds of debates around this book, which is in many ways an imported American culture war. So even as someone like De Wever complains about the influence of sort of noxious American academics, at the same time, he's Americanizing his own political culture by buying and importing this frame. And it was meant to convince people that the NVA had not become an establishment party that somehow was afraid to offend liberal sensibilities. So it's a kind of tactical injection of illiberalism where the party had become too normal in many ways. And I think on the long term, it did work, because electorally it gave them that strategic margin over the Flemish interest, which they had lost for a while in opinion polling 2 or 3 years ago.
Interesting. So it works more as kind of intra-right competition,
Yes.
rather than bashing the left or something.
I guess there's a general lesson there insofar as, yes, a lot of it has to do with kind of strategic considerations on the right rather than a sort of broader social debate.
All right, so onto American politics, American hyperpolitics.
I mean, a country we don't talk about very often, but no, you have to, because, just even as you said at the end there, Alex, like on, and you were saying, Anton, like wokeness started in America, now it's everywhere. It's the triumph of American idealism, as some people might put it. But yeah, I wanted to ask you a few questions about your piece in the New Left Review on hyperpolitics in America. I think it's a really clear statement of some of the things that you've been talking about for a while, and we've spoken about on this podcast. And I think it is a good frame for understanding contemporary politics. So just in case listeners haven't heard those previous episodes and aren't minded to pause this one and go back and listen to those, maybe just to start off with, what is hyperpolitics? In the piece, you say it's a form of politicization without clear political consequences. Is there anything else which is really important for that kind of definition for listeners who, as I said, might not have heard us talk about it before, as to what hyperpolitics is?
So, and I think it's my valiant and limited attempt to give a socially or sort of social scientifically accurate rendering of what's being called the vibe shift. So the idea is to actually quantify or at least formalize some undeniable sense that there's been a profound shift in the dynamics of political engagement in the last 10 to 15 years. And certainly for people who can register the contrast with the 1990s and with the 2000s, that there's been a profound change in political culture, and that there's something to be theorized there, and preferably you can at least back up that theorization or hypothesis with some data. And I mean, the way that it's done in the piece and also in the book that came out is that you have two axes which you can track. One is a kind of politicization axis, where you just look like how many people are voting, how many people are striking, how many people are protesting. So that is the repertoire of political action. And then you have a kind of socialization or institutionalization axis, which is not just about political action, but particularly about affiliation and membership. So how many people are members of unions, parties, and other civil society organizations. And what the 2010s indicate, and this is something that's very easy to look up, I mean, there's a lot of data around this, is that the long-term crisis of the membership model, so whether it's party membership, unionization rates, but also now religious institutions, which in the US, for example, is quite a spectacular development, all of those continued their decade-long decline. So in that sense, the bowling alone story of desocialization we're quite familiar with has really accelerated, and the recent narrative of the loneliness epidemic, I think, just exemplifies the social side of it. But when you look at another metric, namely protest activity, particularly protest activity, because strike activity and voting, but even voting, you could see that there's actually been upticks, even in European elections, which many people couldn't even imagine that more people would one day show up for a European election. There you actually see quite a spectacular rise. And hyperpolitics is just a conceptual attempt to taxonomize that new situation and to say, so how is it new, how is it similar, and how is it different from the preceding forms? And most importantly, what distinguishes it both from the post-politics from the 90s and 2000s, which you, of course, have also discussed in your book, but then also the mass politics of the 20th century, in which you could clearly see that high politicization, for example, in the 20s and 30s, always went hand in hand with very strong institutionalization. Being politically active in the 20s and 30s in Germany, but also elsewhere, meant being a card-carrying party member. That absolutely is not the case today. And hyperpolitics is just an attempt to put a label on this relatively new situation.
Yeah, I mean, there are, I guess, other labels, other people theorizing the same thing, but I think it's just a clear expression of that situation of high politicization, low social bases, where maybe social bases of politics, where maybe post-politics was low politicization and low social bases. But I did want to ask, like, what terms, because I do like tables, as regular listeners will know, although they don't really work on a podcast. But I'm going to kind of imagine in your mind's eye, listener, like 2 by 2, high and low of politicization and social bases. So you have the high social bases of politics in this kind of era of mass politics from the 1890s to the 1960s. What would we call it if we had high politicization and high social bases of politics, or low politicization and high social bases of politics? So because we've got the kind of the hyper, the post, and I had some, I had some ideas, and there are some competing options, but
So
can I just jump in, because it does sound like, I'm just thinking, like, what would be high engagement? It's a misleading term, I think, here, because it can be interpreted as exactly the opposite. Engagement is very closely associated with hyperpolitics and hypermedia. Engagement in terms of long-term, real-world commitment to organizations and practices, right? So it's like kind of slow and steady kind of stuff, and in the real world, being member of a genuine political party with grassroots, etc. Anyway, so high levels of civic engagement and low levels of politicization is a conservative dream, right? I think, right? Everyone's kind of in their little groups and boxes and whatever, but no one the passions are pretty low, and that
Yeah.
maybe is a vision of the 1950s in the Western world.
Absolutely.
I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think it's a kind of Tocquevillian utopia where dense civic
Yeah.
networks, but not a lot of political agitations or very few protests. Yeah, so I'm actually turning the book into an English version now, which should be out this year. It's proven a difficult adaptation effort because the original was in German. But there's basically a quadrant which consists of 4 forms in the book. So you have mass politics, post-politics, anti-politics, and hyperpolitics. So there's considerable overlap, obviously, what you guys did in the book as well. And mass politics is actually, I think, cleaved into 2 halves in the book as well. And there's a kind of internal nuance to be made there, where you have a wild phase of mass politics, and then you have an embedded phase of mass politics. And the wild phase, I think, is very clearly the 20s and the 30s. And particularly the 20s also from the left, where the confrontation between fascist and communist organizations qualifies fully for extremely high politicization, but also very strong institutionalization. Then the 30s, of course, I think obey the same logic. And then the 40s and 50s, and I think the 50s are a good case of this. And the 60s before 68, we could also mention, is a more embedded, calmer type or more stabilized form of mass politics. It's called organized democracy, as political scientists call it, for that reason, because there is relative depoliticization. So the institutionalization remains very high. I mean, party membership and all of that, civil society and religious engagement remains impressively elevated. But at the same time, it's very clear that compared to the 20s and 30s, whether it's strikes or protests, it's less spectacular. And then the 70s, I'd say, are an interesting intermediate period because they're both high politicization, a lot of strikes and a lot of protest, and still institutionalization, but not with the typical model from the 20s and 30s. But then, as you say, post-politics is a double decline in that you have both desocialization and depoliticization at the same time. And then we could still talk about distinction between anti and hyperpolitics, but this is where things get very detailistic, if you want to say. So maybe we can leave that for a different discussion.
No, I was following along, but I think I did introduce this and I did say I like table, but I think it's really clarifying, and one of the reasons why I think hyperpolitics is a great way to describe it is because I think taking seriously this, idea that Peter May wasn't the only one, but very, famously put this forward, that this is the situation that we're essentially facing in contemporary politics. That we have a void where the institutions of politics, the representative institutions used to be, and so populism is a creature of that void and is not really trying to solve that problem, but just to triumph within it. Anyway, I wanted to Sorry, go on, Alex.
Well, no, because you mentioned institutions, so I thought it might be worth bringing this in, because you write that the result of all this hyperpolitics is a preponderance of social media wars of movement over institution building wars of position, with the primary forms of engagement, of political engagement, as fleeting market transactions, or as fleeting as market transactions. And I think that's right, but I think there's something else going on in relation to institutions, which is that political antagonism today often presents itself as institution maintainers or institution defenders as against institution destroyers, right? The Democrats see themselves as the defenders of democracy. Trump comes in and wants to get rid of all that crap, right? And obviously there's a kind of shadow puppetry, I think, going on insofar as the institutions which are being defended not in their content, but purely in their form. So the Democrats aren't defending democracy. They're defending democratic institutions, which are often themselves hollowed out or are counter-majoritarian ones. So they're defending the Supreme Court or the Senate or something as against, maybe not so much the Senate in the case of the Democrats, but anyway, defending the courts, for example. And the institution destroyers also never really see through their destruction. They more often than not just demoralize existing institutions and maybe hollow them out even further, or cast them with such cynicism that there's even less buy-in into these institutions which are already hollowed out. So there's kind of this thing going on that, there's a play kind of being enacted around institutions, and there's actually no institution builders on the scene at all, right? No one's kind of seeking to build new institutions.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it speaks to a discussion that's also been had on this podcast before between that secret and uncomfortable complementarity between populism and technocracy in its contemporary forms, where certainly for hyperpolitics and then. So, once again, I should also mention the chronology or the quadrant I may discuss is in no way exhaustive and doesn't imply a periodization that's very abrupt. So, it's not as if you can say, this is where this form ends, this is where this form starts. It's more a sort of gravitational field in which you have a variety of forces and they have relative distributions of power. I'd say there's still a lot of anti-politics around today. There's still a lot of post-politics around. There's even some mass politics around. So it's not as if that has completely disappeared. It's just that hyperpolitics is one of those force fields and it deserves to be taken seriously. And I think in the confrontation between hyperpolitics and varieties of post-politics you mentioned before, it's precisely the fact that you have a refusal for institutionalization that leaves the task of institutionalization to these other actors, but then there's not actually an interest in seeing how you might embody or might actually give these institutions a new mandate, for example. And once again, in the US, they're actually deconstructing the administrative state at this point. So I think the kind of Leninist revolution that Musk and the Trumpite Camarilla actually wanted to instigate is now happening. But it's proven very, very difficult to defend that administrative state, both in a philosophical and a political sense, because fewer and fewer people. It's a kind of checks and balances argument. It's just like, who is now actually able to mount a worthy defense of a state that in many ways was also shaped by the American left? I mean, the administrative state is not purely a right-wing or a liberal creation. It certainly also has a kind of left-wing genealogy. But because the task of institutionalization has only been left to a certain camp of technocrats, it's proven very difficult to resist at this point. And if hyperpolitics, even as you say, refuses the task of institutionalization, it has no answer to this question whatsoever.
Yeah. I guess one of the implications of the piece is, we have hyperpolitics in America. What does this mean for the rest of us? What are the kind of, we've already talked about wokeness, and it does seem like a lot of the ways of doing American politics. I did suggest to Alex before we started recording that for this part we should have just like the Super Bowl, we should have get Kendrick on as a halftime show of the podcast. But all these kind of spectacular ways of doing politics.
Bunga certainly needs cheerleaders. I mean, I think that
exactly
that's something we've completely overlooked for the past 9 years or whatever.
We've dropped the ball on that one. Anyway, I guess my question, just to put it in a more comprehensible way, is so if we do accept that as you put it in the piece, I'm just read it out, the world hegemon's public sphere has been reoccupied, yet the burst of repoliticization has not increased popular control over government, nor put important areas of policymaking within grasp. So, I mean, does this mean that we're sort of, I guess, compelled to remain within hyperpolitics at the world level? What is because one of the ideas you introduced in the piece is that there is this, I guess, logic of development, hysteresis, which is kind of development through inertia. Is this what we're going to be experiencing, I guess, in terms of the logic that can move? Because it seemed like, well, in this podcast, we definitely thought, or the end of history book is definitely trying to take seriously the idea that it looked like post-politics was never going to end. It looked like the end of history was around forever at one time, and then suddenly it ended pretty quickly. So what is the kind of the implication, I guess, of American hyperpolitics for the rest of us in Belgium or Brazil or London?
So I think there are several levels to be examined here. I mean, the first is obviously just American cultural power still, which means, going back to De Wever, for example, and his book, is that even as the relative geopolitical weight or geoeconomic weight of the US is declining, its cultural hegemony, particularly in the Western world, is really increasing. So, I mean, if you contrast European culture in the 70s to today, it's very clear that you have more distinctly national literatures, national cinemas, etc., etc. And now Americanization has really, reached a much more aggressive phase. And this means that a lot of cultural trends will translate into political trends. And since there's a kind of trickle down effect, it means that we're increasingly becoming Americans in Europe as well. And this immediately means a hyperpolitical transmission belt across the ocean. At the same time, what I do think another international effect is you can, I mean, the US is still the de facto hegemon, and it has a highly chaotic public sphere subject to these hyper political convulsions. Now, as you can see, also with the current administration, this obviously has consequences for how, for example, Europe positions itself in the world. So it's not as if American hyperpolitics is a purely American affair. It has international consequences which can be quite destabilizing. And finally, I'll say one thing. There's now been a piece in the New York Times, I think about a week and a half ago, by a writer called Ross Barkan, which is about the absence of any resistance to Trump's second term, in contrast to 2017 after his
No
inauguration.
capital R resistance. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Or hashtag resistance, basically.
Indeed. Yeah.
And he contrasts the two and says there's a real mood of despondence compared to then. It's not as if there's any women's marches. Even the deep state is not mobilizing to the same extent. And his verdict is basically this means that that era of hyperpolitics is over. So my diagnosis, which I was so proud to see vindicated, has now lost its validity. And I mean, I can't predict the I can't predict the future. But one of the things that struck me in the piece is, of course, there's a massive difference, like that resistance energy has dissipated. At the same time, part of the argument of the book is to say that the structural driving force of hyperpolitics is not something that was born yesterday. I mean, it's very old. It's been progressing for a very long time. Once again, I'm not willing to make extravagant predictions, but the idea that these hyperpolitical dynamics are going to disappear because those structural factors are going to disappear, that seems deeply implausible to me. So I'm willing to, I mean, if we're taking bets, I'm willing to make another big bet on this concept. Even if
so just it's worth pointing listeners also to a piece that contributing editor Lee Jones wrote on the neoliberal order breakdown syndrome around Trump too. And I think you can have like higher and lower volume hyper politics, but you know that the structural conditions creating it are still there. I think it's, you know, I think that was always the not the false promise. I think that's the wrong way to put it. But there were a lot of people saying like, yeah, we can will our way beyond the constraint of there being low socialization or fewer social bases of politics by just like tweeting a lot and just by getting really, really mad. And of course, that was never going to happen.
So anyway. Final thing. You go ahead first, Alex. Sorry.
Well, I mean, I was going to make the point. Well, first, we all have intellectual stakes in this matter, and indeed potentially political stakes as well. We've discussed this before. I mean, we've been here before. We discussed it with Ryan Sickgraf on this podcast back in 2022 or 23, where he was pushing the argument. You know, it's over, right? And then you're constantly flitting between to use the meme terms, which are themselves outdated now. You know, it's so over, we're so back. And my point at that time is that, yes, you have these attenuations of hyperpolitics because it's so vibes based, right? Because because it's something which is not anchored in any kind of concrete organizations or institutions or even really political leverage that is able to be exercised. It means that these things kind of wax and wane. It's the nature of hyperpolitics to itself be particularly cyclical, right? It follows the model of high finance, right? Hot money flows in, hot hyperpolitics flows in and flows out and destabilizes an economy, but then it kind of things go back to the way they were. And so, I think Ross Barkan pronouncing on the end of hyperpolitics, I think is probably wrong. Because what would be the outcome of that? Well, it would be a return to post-politics. I mean, to use the quadrants that you kind of identify is like, well, if you take the energy out and there's still no, kind of base building and kind of concrete politics, then you slip back into post-politics. But we're not going there, right? And I think the culture wars continue. The culture wars continue as the predominant form of politics. And, there's a lot of overlap between talking about things in terms of new culture wars or hyperpolitics. But I think the point is that, or the point that I'm trying to reach at, and I'm kind of writing a thing on this, is that culture, and I made this point on the podcast recently, the culture war is a machine for the contained and legitimate expression of dissent. So post-politics was a way of just completely pushing down any expression of politics and not what's the word I'm looking for, distributing and kind of dispersing politics and dispersing it to the private and energies to the private realm. Cultural, and this isn't a kind of conspiratorial account, but culture wars kind of reemerge in the 2010s, where hyperpolitics emerges as a way of allowing dissent to be expressed and antagonism to be expressed, but within a container which is self-perpetuating and only allows for expressions on a kind of cultural and symbolic realm, which are all ultimately expressions of a kind of narcissistic expression of who I am, rather than what are we collectively trying to do together and achieve. And I think in a way that has its correlate, albeit in a completely different plane, would be the correlate with the politics of the 1950s and 1960s that we were describing, like in Western Europe, where you have parliamentary contestation with establishment, between and alternation in government between center right and center left, and extra parliamentary politics is repressed as much as possible. So you have the legitimate expression of contesting worldviews, but in a fairly limited range of possibilities. The same thing is happening, but in hypermedia. The same thing is happening through people angrily tweeting at each other, and it seems explosive and it seems combustible, but it has no traction. And I think, maybe I'm to a certain extent redescribing hyperpolitics back to you, Anton, but I think my point is more to draw attention to the way that in its culture war format, it seems hot, but it's contained. It's kind of very much within I don't know the right metaphor. It's not a pressure cooker, right? But
yeah, if you want my feedback on this point you're developing and this thing you're going to write, Alex, you need to talk about vibes more. That's an important part. That's how Anton introduced it, and it's vibe analysis, which is important.
I think there's one thing about the international thing I just add on to that, which is that culture wars increasingly has an international dimension, right? And it's both in the sense that we've talked about of Europeans consuming American culture wars and regurgitating culture wars and reformulating that, but in American terms, in US frames. But it's also that national culture wars increasingly use international symbols, or the symbols from international politics for domestic culture wars. So, waving an Israeli or a Palestinian flag in Brazil, where it's like, well, what the hell is this actually about? It's more about the staking out of cultural positions within a domestic political arena, rather than kind of any relation to the international politics happening over there. And same goes for, waving a Ukrainian or a Russian flag or anything else of that matter. And then there's a third thing, which is international politics itself increasingly uses as its kind of discursive material these kind of symbolic things, right? So U.S. diplomacy, now this is ending, but U.S. diplomacy, having go to American embassies and they have pride flags on the outside of them, or Russia standing up for true patriotic traditional values and being so it's not like the Cold War of capitalism versus socialism, but it's like pride flags versus neo-trad, and it's very frothy, it's very vibes based, but it takes again like this format of culture war where it's like it's a kind of there's a phoniness to it, because it doesn't, I don't know. I say there's a phoniness to it. I think now we're entering an age, particularly with Trump, and I think we're going to come on to this, where the stakes are increasingly high in international affairs, such that you can laugh at Putin's posturing or whatever, but these things have much higher stakes.
Yeah. It's certainly not a kind of quotidian affair anymore. And I think, to get back to the Barkan point, you'd have to at least clearly spell out what you think the successor is, or the replacement is going to be for this current mode. And I don't think there's a very convincing theory for it. Of course, the idea there's going to be a reversion or a revival of something like a mass political mode seems deeply implausible, or at least we don't see that many signs of it. And once again, I think there's a genie that has left the bottle that just can't be put in anymore. Firstly, that the very reason that the 2010s were like the populist decade, which in the end gave birth to hyperpolitics as we know it today. Also, just has to do with the fact that the material preconditions for something like post-politics simply didn't apply anymore. So the kind of credit boom and the modes of managing popular dissent and consent in the 90s and 2000s, namely through quite aggressive depoliticization, could be cushioned through a specific economic regime as well. And that economic regime already began to come apart in 2010s, and it's certainly coming apart today. If you look at the prospects both in the US and Europe, it's unlikely that it'll be easy to contain any type of political discontent about what's happening.
Yeah.
And then there's the additional fact, of course, and I think this is more in the output rather than input side of this analysis, is the radical decrease in the cost of political expression, which the internet has instigated. So the fact that the political repertoire, which was still quite demanding, I'd say, in the 90s and 80s, has now really, really broadened through digital engagement. This means, once again, that I don't find convincing the idea that, oh, people are no longer resisting, so this mode is now over and we're moving into something else. But I mean, well, two of the main structural factors that drove it are still around and are likely to flare up very aggressively again. And you've not actually told us what the successor or the alternative is going to be to this.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's plenty of evidence of kind of withdrawal, disengagement, exhaustion, but that only, if there's something to withdraw to in terms of private consumption and subcultures and so on, then fine. But
Yes.
increasingly, people can't afford that. So, there's only so much you can get out of, gaming and Netflix and wanking. And so there's,
but even as you say, even those purely private spheres are being politicized now.
Yeah, there's
and
no
they're
escape.
becoming the stake of kind of political contestation, and a lot of people are exhausted by it. But it's not as if they can just get away from this politicization either.
So, turning to European decline.
Hello friends, you've reached the end of a sample from an episode only available to subscribers. We put out 2 episodes a month for free. For access to the rest in its entirety, please join us at patreon.com/bungacast. For $7 a month, subscribers receive original, exclusive episodes with the entirety of the BungaCast cast. That's George Hoare, myself Alex Hochuli, and our contributing editors, Philip Cunliffe, Amber Lee Frost, Catherine Liu, Lee Jones, Alex Gurevich, and Lee Phillips. We've got extended interviews with guests, episodes on current affairs, and original episodes on theory, history, and culture, so as to understand the crises of our times. We also have the BungaCast Reading Club, where Phil, George, and myself present the key books and essays necessary for understanding the world today, how we got here, and where we might be going. Subscribers also get a digital subscription to Damage Magazine, with whom we're partnered, and you can find all this info at patreon.com/bungacast. We do hope you'll join us. These are turbulent times, and ideologically confused ones as well. What we try to do is find political clarity, to move beyond the decadent age of Bunga Bunga.